the middle of the 19th century, Manchester had become more than a city. It was an engine, restless, deafening, and luminous with ambition. In the 1850s, its skyline bristled with chimneys instead of church spires, and its pulse was measured not by bells but by the turning of factory wheels. Situated in the damp lowlands of northwest England, fed by the rivers Irwell, Irk, and Medlock, Manchester had grown from a modest market town into the industrial heart of Britain in less than a century. Geography, technology, and empire converged here, forging a place that would come to define the modern age. The city's transformation was rooted in cotton. Raw bales arrived from the American South, Egypt, and India, hauled inland from Liverpool's docks along canals and railways that stitched Manchester into a global web of trade. Steam power replaced the old rhythms of water wheels, freeing factories from riverbanks and allowing mills to rise wherever land could be claimed. By the 1850s, the city was often called Cottonopolis, its mills producing vast quantities of cloth that clothed Europe and reached markets across the world. Wealth accumulated quickly, but unevenly, and the physical shape of Manchester reflected this imbalance with stark clarity. Approaching the city, one first encountered the smoke. Coal fires burned day and night, and a gray haze settled permanently over streets and rooftops. Visitors described a sun that rose pale and dim, its light filtered through soot-laden air. The smell of oil, damp brick, and human labor clung to everything. Yet beneath this grim exterior was an undeniable energy. Streets teemed with carts, clerks, mill girls, and merchants. Warehouses lined the canals, their tall windows glowing in the early morning as work began before dawn. Politically, Manchester stood at the forefront of change. It had been a center of radical thought since the early decades of industrialization, shaped by events such as the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, when peaceful reformers were cut down by cavalry in nearby St. Peter's Field. The memory of that violence lingered in the 1850s, sharpening debates about representation, workers' rights, and the responsibilities of power. Although Manchester had gained parliamentary representation by mid-century, many of its inhabitants, especially the working poor, remained excluded from meaningful political voice. Daily life in the city was governed by the clock. Factory bells dictated waking hours, meal breaks, and sleep. In the vast spinning rooms, machines thundered relentlessly, drowning conversation and forcing workers to communicate through gestures and glances. Men, women, and children labored side by side, their bodies attuned to the rhythm of the looms. A single mistake could cost fingers or limbs, and accidents were an accepted, if tragic, part of the industrial order. Outside the mills, the city's residential districts revealed another side of Manchester's reality. In areas such as Ancoats and Angel Meadow, rows of cramped brick houses pressed against one another, often built hastily to accommodate a swelling population. Sanitation lagged far behind growth. Open drains ran along streets, and outbreaks of cholera and typhus were grimly familiar. Infant mortality rates were high, and life expectancy for the urban poor remained shockingly low. Yet even here, resilience flourished. Families took in lodgers to survive, neighbors shared food and news, and community ties formed in the narrow spaces between hardship and hope. Religion and reform offered solace and structure. Churches and chapels multiplied alongside factories, catering to Anglicans, nonconformists, and Catholics alike. Sunday schools educated children who worked long hours during the week, while philanthropic societies attempted, sometimes sincerely, sometimes paternalistically, to soften the harsher edges of industrial life. Manchester was a testing ground for new ideas about social responsibility, where reformers debated how a city built on profit might also sustain human dignity. Thus, as the 1850s dawned, Manchester stood balanced between promise and peril. Its wealth and productivity were unmatched, its influence felt far beyond Britain's shores. Yet the same forces that drove its success, speed, scale, and relentless demand, also strained its people and its environment. The foundations had been laid, and the first light of modern industry burned brightly. What followed would reveal the full cost and the enduring legacy of this unprecedented transformation. To understand Manchester in the 1850s, one must move through its social layers, each shaped by power and proximity to the machines that ruled the city. At the top stood mill owners and industrialists, many of whom lived in spacious homes on the city's outskirts or in newly developed suburbs such as Didsbury and Chorlton-on-Medlock. Their wealth was visible in grand civic projects, libraries, concert halls, and imposing warehouses that projected confidence and moral authority. They saw themselves as builders of progress, men who had harnessed technology and trade for national prosperity. Below them was a growing middle class of clerks, managers, engineers, and shopkeepers. This group benefited from the industrial economy while remaining vulnerable to its fluctuations. Education and respectability were their shields, and many embraced self-improvement as both a personal virtue and a social marker. Mechanics, institutes, lecture halls, and newspapers flourished, reflecting Manchester's reputation as a city of ideas as well as industry. The working class formed the city's vast majority. Their lives were marked by long hours, modest wages, and constant uncertainty. Employment could vanish overnight if orders fell or machinery was upgraded. Women made up a significant portion of the textile workforce, valued for their dexterity and paid less than men. Children, though increasingly regulated by factory acts, were still a common sight in mills, their labor essential to family survival. Education for them was often fragmented, squeezed between shifts and exhaustion. Power flowed through ownership and capital, but it was contested daily on the factory floor and in the streets. Trade unions, though still fragile and often suppressed, began to organize workers around shared grievances. Strikes erupted sporadically, testing the resolve of employers and the endurance of laborers who could ill afford lost wages. The Chartist movement, demanding political reform and universal male suffrage, found strong support in Manchester, where economic injustice and political exclusion were deeply intertwined. Religion intersected with these struggles in complex ways. Some clergy preached obedience and patience, urging workers to accept hardship as part of a divine order. Others aligned themselves with reform, advocating better conditions and moral responsibility among employers. Nonconformist chapels often doubled as meeting places for political discussion, blurring the line between faith and activism. Global events also cast long shadows over local lives. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, but was anticipated by growing tensions in the 1850s, threatened Manchester's cotton supply. Even before the conflict erupted, fluctuations in trade revealed the city's dependence on distant lands and enslaved labor. This uneasy awareness fueled debates about ethics, empire, and the true cost of industrial prosperity. Violence, though not constant, was never far removed. Policing expanded as authorities sought to maintain order in crowded neighborhoods. Public executions had ended, but the spectacle of punishment persisted in courtrooms and prisons. At the same time, cultural life offered moments of escape. Music halls, cheap theaters, and public houses provided entertainment and community, though reformers often viewed them with suspicion. Manchester in the 1850s was thus a city in negotiation with itself. Every innovation brought both opportunity and strain. Every assertion of power provoked resistance. The clang of machinery was matched by the murmur of debate, the arguments of pamphlets, sermons, and speeches echoing through streets and halls. Life here was shaped by forces larger than any individual, yet it was lived intensely, with a keen awareness that the city's future, and perhaps the world's, was being forged in real time. By the late 1850s, Manchester had reached a peak that felt both triumphant and precarious. Its output was immense, its reputation global. Visitors arrived from across Europe and America to study its mills, its transport networks, and its methods of organization. Manchester had become a model, admired, imitated, and feared. It represented what industrial society could achieve when driven by innovation and capital, unencumbered by tradition. Yet signs of strain were increasingly visible. Environmental damage had become impossible to ignore. Rivers ran dark with industrial waste, and clean water was a scarce commodity in many districts. Reformers pressed for public health measures, arguing that disease and pollution threatened not only the poor but the stability of the city itself. Gradually, municipal authorities began to act, investing in sanitation, water supply, and urban planning. These efforts marked a turning point, signaling a growing recognition that unchecked growth carried profound risks. The cotton economy, too, revealed its fragility. Dependence on global supply chains left Manchester vulnerable to distant political events. When the American Civil War eventually cut off cotton imports, the city would face the cotton famine, throwing thousands out of work and exposing the human cost of industrial interdependence. Though this crisis lay just beyond the 1850s, its approach could already be sensed in anxious discussions among merchants and workers alike. Culturally and intellectually, Manchester's influence deepened. Thinkers such as Friedrich Engels had already chronicled the conditions of its working class, using the city as a lens through which to examine capitalism itself. Manchester became shorthand for the industrial experience, its possibilities and its brutalities. At the same time, the city fostered innovation in science, engineering, and commerce, laying foundations for future advances. The legacy of Manchester in the 1850s is not one of simple triumph or failure. It is a story of transformation at unprecedented speed, of human ingenuity harnessed on a vast scale, and of social structures forced to adapt under immense pressure. The city demonstrated that industrial power could reshape landscapes, economies, and lives within a single generation. It also revealed the moral and political questions that such power inevitably raises. As the smoke drifted over its rooftops and the machines continued their relentless motion, Manchester stood as both a warning and a promise. It showed the world what modern industry could build and what it could cost. In its streets and mills were written the early chapters of the urban, industrial age that would define the centuries to come. The workshop of Britain had forged more than cloth and wealth. It had forged the contours of the modern world, leaving a legacy that still shapes how societies understand progress, power, and responsibility.